The next speaker is our keynote speaker, presenting on security in a multipolar world. Trump, Putin, Xi Jinping, how three wild cards are overturning global security. Peter Jennings, AO, PSM, Director of the Strategic Analysis Australia and Executive Director of Peter Jennings Strategy Consultants. Peter is the Executive Director of Peter Jennings Strategy Consultants and Adjunct Fellow with the Institute of Policy Studies and a columnist for the Australian newspaper. He is also the co-author of a book, No Higher Priority, a Blueprint for Immediate Action on Australia's Defence 25 to 28. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Lovely, thank you. Well, good morning, everyone. I'll just get myself organised here with my timer because there's coffee after once I've finished, so I don't want to hold you up too much for that. As my bio suggests, I've worked in Canberra for almost 35 years now, so I'm used to working with deep fakes and possibly a few shallow fakes as well. And my remit today is to talk about security in a multipolar world. In particular, what I'm going to do is talk about three personalities, three political leaders whose decisions are going to shape international security in coming decades in ways that I think are going to be massively consequential for Australia, and I'd suggest for business interests in the room today. And of course, I'm talking about Donald Trump, Vladimir Putin, and Xi Jinping, the three leaders who we see pretty much on our television screens every night, yet we know little about their personalities, certainly about Xi and Putin, and understand little about what motivates their decision-making and how they see their future priorities. So what I want to do is spend a little bit of time digging into their personal backgrounds of these leaders, and I'm going to make some suggestions about how that impacts on their decision-making today. I guess if I'd been preparing this talk yesterday, I might have included Ayatollah Khamenei, the supreme leader of Iran, after the pretty amazing news that the Iranian Republican Guards Corps had been engaging in at least two, possibly more terrorist actions in Australia last year. And we saw the Iranian ambassador and three of his chums expelled yesterday from the country. First time since the end of the Second World War that an ambassador has been expelled. So the point about global political leaders having an impact on Australian security, I think, is really hits home with that incident. So let me talk a little bit about these three uniquely powerful leaders, at least two of whom I think are increasing the risk for armed conflict around the world, and the risk that creates for shocks in Australia. And I'll start with Donald Trump. So many of you would know that Trump came from an immigrant family. His grandfather, Frederick Trump, moved to the United States from Karlstadt in Germany in 1885. He was actually attracted to the United States by the Klondike gold rushes, but after a few years of panning, he moved into the real estate business in New York. Trump's mother, Mary Ann MacLeod, was born in the Outer Hebrides of Scotland, which is something that Trump refers to whenever he goes to the United Kingdom. She immigrated to the United States around 1930, and Trump's father, Fred Trump, was born in New York City and became a major real estate developer, building tens of thousands of homes across Queens and Brooklyn through his firm Elizabeth Trump and Sons. Donald Trump was the fourth of five children, born in 1946, a family background which is the classic American story, American immigrant story of rags to riches. And here's a photo of the young Trump family in the 1950s, a very blonde Donald Trump there on the right, on the left-hand side of the photo. Now, it's fair to say that growing up, Trump lived a better than middle-class life in New York, all family wealth really earned through hard work, not inheritance. And Trump's own account of his upbringing was that he was something of a rowdy and unruly boy in Queens. So much so, in fact, that his family decided to send him to the New York Military Academy. That's Trump there in the center of the photograph. Not really a military organization, but a very strict boarding school known for its military-style discipline. Trump's father, Fred, hoped that the academy's regimental environment would instill some obedience and leadership qualities in his son. And it did. Trump did very well at the academy. He became a student leader. He was a very talented sportsman. He was probably just a little bit short of being able to pursue a career as a professional baseballer. And Trump later credited the New York Military Academy with giving him confidence, toughness, and organization skills. He used to accompany his father to building sites. He credited Fred Trump with teaching him the basics of the building business, negotiating and communicating with contractors. He then went to the Wharton Business School at the University of Pennsylvania, graduating not particularly brilliantly, it must be said, with a degree in economics, and joined his father's company. And his first projects were managing existing apartment complexes in Brisbane and Queens. When he was only 25, in 1971, Donald was made president of the company by his father, and he immediately rebranded it as the Trump Organization. He established a reputation for himself as a risk taker, much more so than his dad. He had early breakthrough projects, establishing something called the Commodore Hotel near Grand Central Station, and then very early in his career, Trump Tower on Fifth Avenue, the 58-story skyscraper which cemented his brand in high-end real estate. Now, if I was looking for one defining moment in Trump's career, I think it came in the 1990s when he faced significant business challenges, including the risk of bankruptcy. He overextended his business, borrowing money to fund casinos, establish an airline, the Trump Shuttle, and in 1991 and 92, several of the casinos which he established went into Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. The Taj Mahal in Atlantic City, Trump Castle, Trump Plaza, Trump hotels and casinos note a certain similarity to the name. Trump avoided bankruptcy. He did have to give up some control of his holdings and face tougher bank terms for loans, but he succeeded in renegotiating his debt, and he kept his name on the properties. And at that time, he started to rebrand himself as a person who was a resilient survivor in business. In 1997, he wrote a book, Trump, The Art of the Comeback. But, of course, it was Trump's time on the NBC show, The Apprentice, starting in January 2004, which created the nationwide platform that turned him into a significant media celebrity. Trump played the role of a tough, successful business mogul embodying wealth and power. Episodes were filmed in the Trump Tower with boardroom showdowns, showcasing Trump being the decisive leader. And The Apprentice show was a huge hit. At its height, it was getting 20 million viewers in the United States. And Trump became one of the highest paid TV personalities, reportedly earning up to $1 million per episode at the peak of his success. It was The Apprentice which arguably laid the groundwork for Trump's 2016 presidential run, giving him a national platform and a loyal fan base, and presenting in a dramatized way the image of Trump as a successful executive. Of course, you all remember the catchphrase, "You're fired," which became a cultural shorthand for decisiveness. He started thinking about a run for the presidency in the early 2000s, but ultimately he didn't run until 2016 when he campaigned on a platform of America First nationalism, tough immigration policies, trade protectionism, and a sort of an anti-establishment line of drain the swamp. His November 2016 win against Hillary Clinton was regarded as surprising at the time, largely by carrying working-class voters in the key Rust Belt states. Now, thinking back to that first term, it was marked by a lack of preparation and bringing forward a policy agenda, a rotating door of White House officials, many that lasted only months. He had to deal, of course, with the early stages of COVID and pandemic preparation. And I think another feature of his term was a strengthening of bipartisan concern about the risk of China as a strategic competitor to American power in the world. Many of us will also recall the remarkable situation after the 2020 election, won by Joe Biden, where Trump denied the election result, leading to riots in Washington, D.C. on the 6th of January 2021. For me, the first Trump term, I think, is indelibly linked to his attempt to negotiate a deal with Kim Jong-un, little rocket man of North Korea, to try to persuade the North Koreans to denuclearize. 2 meetings between Trump and Kim, one in Singapore, one in Vietnam, where it became clear that the North was not going to hand over its nuclear weapons. But it was a striking example of Trump's willingness to try to negotiate a deal with almost anyone. And I would have said probably at the time, at the end of his first term, people would have judged that was the end of his political career. But one of the remarkable things was his determination to seek the Republican nomination for 2024. And here's a remarkable photograph of Trump, of the assassination attempt on Trump in Butler in Pennsylvania ahead of the 2024 election. You can see the bullet circled in red that has just nicked Trump's ear. So that's Donald Trump. I want to turn to China's leader, Xi Jinping. Xi was the son of a Chinese Communist Party royalty, effectively. Xi's father, Xi Jinping, who's there on the left, had joined the Communist Party in the 1920s, taken part in the Long March as part of the first generation of revolutionaries under Mao Zedong, and held senior positions in the People's Republic after the Communist Party takeover. This is an image of the younger Xi on the left with his father from the middle 1950s. Xi grew up living a very comfortable life in the leadership compound in Beijing, surrounded by a remarkably poor China. The princely life lasted until Xi's father had a significant falling out with Mao Zedong in the 1960s. Here's a remarkable photo of Xi's dad, Xi Jinping, purged by the Red Guard. That's him with the placard around his chest, describing himself as an anti-party element. And Xi Sr.'s crime had been to differ with Mao over Mao's hardline policies in the Chinese countryside, which was creating a famine and leading to millions of people being killed. As a result of that, Xi Jinping, the dad, was imprisoned for a decade. And during that time, as a young teenager, Xi Jinping was exiled to the countryside to go through a process of re-education. He spent a decade engaged in hard manual labor. This is an image of the so-called cave that Xi lived in. Really, it was an area where homes were hollowed out of limestone cliffs and caves. And this has become something of a tourist attraction in China. I don't know if the image is actually contemporary to the time, but you can see posters of Karl Marx, Friedrich Engels, Lenin and Stalin on the wall. And during this time, in his later teens, Xi read deeply into Marxist-Leninist writings, cultivating a particular interest in the writings of Joseph Stalin. Here's a comment from Xi reflecting back on his experience as a youngster. Excuse me. When I went to the countryside as a 15-year-old, I was perplexed and lost. By the time I left at the age of 22, I had a clear life goal and was filled with confidence. There's a remarkable American diplomatic cable which was leaked during the WikiLeaks scandal, reporting on the personality of Xi Jinping after he'd been made General Secretary of the Communist Party in 2012. And it quotes a friend of Xi saying that after he'd left the countryside at the age of about 22 and gone to Beijing, this was a time when many of his friends and contemporaries were doing their best not to be involved in politics. They were chasing girls and watching American cowboy movies. But Xi Jinping had decided that he was going to be redder than red. He decided he was going to have a career inside the Chinese Communist Party. And that's exactly what he did. One of his first jobs was to be secretary to a general in the Central Military Commission, the headquarters of the Chinese military. And from there, he went into the countryside as a deputy party secretary, climbing the ranks in a fairly remote province, and then moving to more senior party positions in coastal provinces. And I won't talk through his career moves in detail before becoming general secretary, but basically he climbed the ladder. And during that time, he built a reputation for himself for not being corrupt and for prosecuting corrupt officials inside the Communist Party and for and other government organizations. And this has actually been one of the keys to Xi's political success. There was and continues to be significant corruption inside the party and the military. But Xi has also been able to use this to promote his own political supporters and to attack his political opponents. When I was a senior defence official in Canberra, I had the opportunity to spend some time with a Chinese four-star general called Guo Bojiang, who at the time he visited Australia in about 2016, was the most senior People's Liberation Army general to visit Australia. Why I'm telling you that story is that Guo is now spending the rest of his life in jail. He was accused of corruption charges, of selling officer commissions in the PLA, and I have absolutely no doubt that he was guilty of that because it's a practice which still continues inside the PLA today. But Guo's real crime was that he was an acolyte of Jiang Zemin, who was a factional opponent of Xi. And here's a rather remarkable photo, which I'm sure you'll remember from October of 2022, which shows Hu Jintao, one of the sort of more liberal reformers inside the Chinese Communist Party, being physically escorted from the Great Hall of the People during a party meeting. And note the expression on the faces of those individuals on the front row. This was a power play of Xi to demonstrate his complete control over the Communist Party. So Xi has used purges of the party, the military and the intelligence apparatus, not only to remove factional enemies, but to put his own people into positions of authority, and then to replace those loyalists regularly, just like Joseph Stalin did in the 1950s, making sure that no opposition base can ever fall. And here's a photo of Xi speaking at Tiananmen Square on the 100th anniversary of the Communist Party, wearing very distinctively a Mao suit in the style of what Chairman Mao would have worn 50 years or so earlier. If you broaden the photo out, you'll see the rest of the Chinese Politburo standing there in their Xenia suits. Xi is actually, through his dress, making a point to the Chinese people that he is uniquely powerful, just like Chairman Mao, and the Chinese leader, best able to deliver what he calls the China dream. Just going to get myself a drink of water here. And I think it's also worth pointing out that of all the international leaders that Xi Jinping has made contact with over the years, Vladimir Putin is the person that he's most connected to. They've actually met 40 times since Xi has become General Secretary of the party in 2012. And whenever he does, the Chinese media runs a quote of Xi saying to Putin, well, right now we are going through immensely changing times, the likes of which we've not seen for 100 years, and we're driving those changes. Let me turn to Vladimir Putin. This is a photo of him with his parents. Vladimir came from a very poor working class background in Leningrad, now St. Petersburg, shaped by war hardships. His father, who you see there on the left, also Vladimir Putin, worked at a train factory. He was conscripted, the dad, into the Soviet Navy in the Second World War and served with the NKVD secret police, the Russian internal secret police. Putin's mother, Maria Putana, was a factory worker. She survived the brutal Nazi siege of Leningrad. Putin was born in October of 1952, the youngest of three boys. Of his two elder brothers, both died before his birth, including one who died in the siege of Leningrad. His childhood accounts describe an environment of being emotionally distanced from his parents, who he often described as being exhausted by the war. Young Putin engaged in fighting, roving the streets of Leningrad with gangs of kids and with little supervision. At the age of 12, he began practicing judo and a Soviet Red Army martial art known as Sambo. That's not meant to be rude, it just is an acronym of Russian words meaning self-defense without weapons. That's the blonde Putin is the person there throwing the heavier opponent. And these martial arts disciplines became central to his idea of discipline and toughness. Here's a comment from Putin talking in 2004 about his childhood. We demonstrated weakness and the weak are beaten. Now, he went to Leningrad State University in 1970, studied law, joined the Communist Party. On graduation in 1975, Putin immediately joined the KGB, the Soviet Union's intelligence and security agency. He had early assignments in Leningrad, and then his first overseas posting came in 1985, where he was posted to Dresden in East Germany, where he acted as a KGB liaison with the Stasi, the East German secret police. Putin was in Germany when the Berlin Wall fell in 1989. He witnessed the collapse of the Soviet Union firsthand, and he later described how he had called for backup in Moscow as crowds surrounded the KGB offices in Dresden. And Moscow was silent, was Putin's comment. And this shaped his later belief in the dangers of state weakness. He returned to Leningrad in 1990 as the Soviet Union was unraveling, resigned from the KGB and went into politics, initially working for the mayor of St. Petersburg. His career break came in 1998 when, having moved to Moscow, he was appointed director of the FSB, the Federal Security Service, which was the successor to the KGB. And in August of that year, Boris Yeltsin appointed Putin as prime minister. At that stage, Putin was low profile, one that seemed to be highly disciplined and focused on protecting Yeltsin as president. And Yeltsin resigned on the 31st of December 1999, and Putin became acting president. He'd made his break into Russian politics. We've come to see Putin at that time as a ruthless leader focused on his own power and control, and one prepared to take significant risks. Most obviously, of course, the first in 2014 involving the invasion of Ukraine by moving into Crimea with so-called little green men, that is, the military personnel who were not wearing Russian uniform. And here's a slide which I'm sure you'll all remember of Putin during the COVID lockdown. I think we all remember this one, the massive long table separating Putin from his underlings. By then we have a leader who is feared, not particularly loved, wealthy through linkages to Russian business oligarchs, although regarded positively by many in the Russian population. And I think we should end this brief survey of Putin's career by considering how close he has become to Xi Jinping of China. Here's an image from just a few weeks ago, which shows Wang Yi, the Chinese foreign minister, telling the European Union that China cannot allow Russia to lose the war in Ukraine. It's just too important to China, not least because of the way it distracts the Americans from 100% attention being focused on China's actions in the Pacific. So that's our three leaders, and if I had to draw some conclusions about the common features of the three, I guess my start of them is to make the point that each of them are outsiders that ultimately became insiders and the absolute leaders of their own country. Each came from fairly unremarkable family backgrounds. Xi's family was propelled into prominence because of the Communist Revolution. Putin was propelled into prominence because of the fall of the Soviet Union. And Trump used the American entertainment industry as his step up. Each has a remarkable work ethic, never giving up even when faced with significant reversals of personal fortune. And they've all shown themselves to be capable of working hard to overcome family and personal national difficulties. Each leader was propelled by a level of ambition that one rarely sees in the community. I think it's also true that they're loners. It's actually very hard to know who they rely on for advice, but they have the confidence to act on their own instincts, and that can be highly risky. Each has a ruthless focus on personal power. It's striking that they have, in their own ways, subordinated the political system around them to their personalities. So Xi, in terms of controlling the Communist Party by eliminating all opposition, Putin in terms of becoming effectively a sole dictator of Russia, and Trump for his ability to take over the Republican Party, which had originally an ideology very different from Trump's MAGA base. In fact, what each leader has done is they promote a cult of personality. The Trump brand, Putin alone at the table as the decision maker, and Xi enshrining his thought into the Chinese constitution, that is, his speeches and writings. And finally, each leader is now focused on cementing their country's position internationally. That seems to be where their principal focus these days. I think it's also worth noting that their separate ambitions bring them into conflict with each other. China can't dominate the Indo-Pacific without compromising American interests. Russia can't dominate Ukraine and Eastern Europe without compromising American interests. For the moment, at least, Russia and China have shelved significant differences that they have between each other over the status of Russia's eastern areas, Siberia, which the Chinese regard as having been unfairly handed over to Russia in the 19th century. So the personalities I've discussed today and the ambitions that they bring to their roles, I think, potentially bring them into deeper conflict over the next few years as they think about, at their age, the last throw of the dice of their personal political leaderships. Okay, so I'm going to start to wind up my presentation here by briefly surveying some trends in the current international situation, and then I will end by talking about what this means from the point of view of Australian security, and maybe also for your business interests. So some quick judgments. First, I think we are going to see continued conflict in Ukraine for some time to come. Even as Russia and Ukraine are slowly and rather reluctantly moving towards, under American pressure, ceasefire and peace discussions. I think it's going to be impossible for Putin to compromise on his objectives to effectively integrate Ukraine into Russia. But even so, our attention is going to focus back onto the Indo-Pacific. Xi Jinping has been telling the People's Liberation Army for years now that they need to prepare for combat by 2027. 2027 happens to be the 100th anniversary of the creation of the People's Liberation Army. Now, the growth of Chinese military power over the last few years has been astonishing, and it's all focused on giving China extended reach into the Pacific. And the flashpoint to be most worried about, of course, is Taiwan. I'll come back to that one. Now, I'm not saying that conflict is inevitable, but it is certainly higher than at any stage in my professional life of being involved with Australia's defence. And if you want one measure to see how China is preparing for military conflict, it's this. This is a graph which shows how China has been reducing the number of, or the value of American Treasury bonds that it holds. That's the line in red. And what China has been doing is purchasing instead gold. That's the line in white. Now, why is that relevant? Well, it's because China observed how hundreds of billions of dollars of Russian assets were frozen by the US and Europe under sanctions after the invasion of Ukraine in 2014 and 2022, because those Russian assets were being held in Western banks. And so China is doing its best to liberate itself from the dominance of the American dollar by buying gold, physical gold, and actually moving it to Chinese repositories on the mainland of China. Now, there are reports speculating about the health of these leaders and how long they'll remain in power. I don't think any of them are vulnerable to being toppled for domestic political reasons or for health reasons anytime soon. So to conclude with some comments about things that you should be watching in terms of geopolitics and its impact on Australia. First, keep a close eye on Chinese military manoeuvres around Taiwan. This is an image of a fairly recent joint exercise, April this year, of Chinese military forces around Taiwan, essentially surrounding the whole island. I think we're quite likely to see, if not an invasion attempt on Taiwan, then a blockade involving the PLA to control air and ship movements towards Taiwan and around North Asia. And that itself will have very significant impacts on Australia, not least on our ability to access fuel, a significant amount of which comes now from South Korea and China. Second, watch the Russia-China relationship very closely. China is following the Ukraine situation extremely closely, in part to help her come to a decision about how to prosecute potential conflict over Taiwan. If there is a conflict over Taiwan, it's likely that it will spread very quickly because the Chinese military understand that they need to preempt American and Japanese military responses. And that's likely to lead to Australia becoming involved in the war, and quickly. Now, there are certainly Australian leaders who hope that we will be able to ride this conflict out without becoming directly involved. Personally, I think that view is illusory, and therefore you need to be thinking about how you, your family, and your business deals with the consequences of Australia becoming involved in military operations at some stage in the next half-decade in our region. That means to say, of course, defence spending is in the spotlight. And you would know that the United States has been publicly saying Australia should spend more on defence. I'm puzzled by our government's refusal to take that concern seriously. Prime Minister Albanese is right to say that these are sovereign decisions. But when your closest ally is expressing concern that we're under-investing in defence, that's something we really must address. One reaction that I often get when I give talks like this is people say, well, they don't want their children or their grandchildren to be caught up in a war. And I should say I certainly don't want that either. But the best way to prevent that from happening is to make the Australian Defence Force as strong as it can be, as soon as possible, because deterrence is the best preventer of war. Then we need to consider the impact of trade and the movement of goods across the sea and of passenger aircraft, and how that will be impacted by conflict. Australia is likely to find itself significantly isolated as a result of conflict taking place in other locations. Cargo ships and tankers will not put to sea, and aircraft won't take off if there's a risk of them being attacked. So what that means is that we might not be able to get the imports that we need, And as our economy is so tightly linked to just-in-time supply of products, we will face shortages, rationing, and very likely substantial inflation or price controls very quickly. I have to say what surprises me, given the strategic outlook, is how little this is debated and discussed in our media. But from a business perspective, I think you need to be attentive to these geostrategic risks in terms of what it might mean for your supply chains, for example, for stock holdings, for your ability to continue to service clients at times when some of these critical supply chain dependencies will be at risk. I recently advised a very prominent IT security company, which turned out that it was absolutely dependent on the continuing supply of critical components from Taiwan. And the question of, okay, well, how long can you continue to support your clients here in Australia if there's a blockade, was sort of met with rather blank stares. So I think there's a need to ask yourself how long you can function under that type of supply chain threat. I'll only touch very briefly on cyber dimension of this, except to say that cyber disturbances, the use of malware to damage critical infrastructure, using hostile cyber attacks to complicate government and the private sector, that is going to be a very early and a major part of any military conflict. The chart just shows most recent government figures on cyber incidents by year. We can expect those to grow significantly. And of course, in the last few years, we've seen cyber incidents which aren't related necessarily to hostile foreign interference, where it's just the complexity of economic linkages and cyber linkages that brings aspects of the economy to a halt. So it's essential to make sure that your business is as safe from cyber intrusion as it can possibly be. Now, I realize that's an obvious point, but it is astonishing just how many companies allow themselves to be vulnerable on these points. So finally, I think we'll continue to see the growth of disruptive protest movements here in Australia, operating inside our capital cities as a vehicle for minority groups to promote their political issues. For example, as we get closer to the risks of military conflict breaking out in our region, I've no doubt there will be Australians who seek to damage our national security capabilities. And there was a recent example of an incident in the United Kingdom where a military aircraft was damaged by political activists getting onto an airbase. That clearly does have implications for the security industry. In what ways that may be the case, well, that's something that might require a second presentation, but I'd urge you to think about the robustness of the systems and measures that we have in place to continue functioning as a country and to deliver security services to customers around Australia. So we're moving into a world where there's going to be more direct action, more protests, more damage, and all of this in a context where the police services will be hard-pressed to respond effectively. Even in an environment short of war, the prospects of conflict in the Indo-Pacific is one which has the potential to do serious harm to the Australian economy, beyond even the level of harm which our own national government is currently imposing on the business community. I'm sure you would have heard reports of how major Australian resource and energy companies are saying that they're not going to be bringing new capital investment into Australia because of red and green tape, because of uncertainty about how welcoming the political environment is for business. There's also concerning data about the number of insolvencies being reported in Australian businesses, which I think is pretty evident when one spends time walking around the CBDs of our major cities. So this is going to take a troubling business environment for the next few years, and I think one that will definitely impact on how the security industry is used, how it's called on to provide support to the wider business community. So colleagues, in the world that I've described, Australia is regrettably a price taker rather than a price setter in global security. It would certainly be to our advantage if Prime Minister Albanese was in a position to engage with President Trump on these issues. Sadly, that's not happening today. It's often been the case, and it was true in the previous world wars, that Australia was not the master of its own strategic destiny. I think that situation continues today. So, on that somewhat unhappy note, I'm going to finish. We do have, I think, a little bit of time left before we're due to take a coffee break. And so I'm very happy to take some questions or comments from the floor. I'm staring into a bright light, but what I might do is just shield my eyes to see if anyone would like to offer some comments or make a question.
What future role do you envision the private security sector playing as part of Australia's national security mix?
So let me break that answer down into two parts. I think there is going to have to be a rethinking of how the Australian Defence Force makes use of private security around bases and facilities. I think that a great deal of that extension out to making use of private security companies happened really during the middle to later 1990s, as a lot of that effort was commercialised through defence seeking to make internal savings. But that was happening at a time when the level of threat against the footprint of the Australian Defence Force in Australia was much, much lower. That is the case now. Now we see significant investment being planned into air and missile defence to protect Australian facilities against external missile attack. And I think one of the lessons that we can take from yesterday's announcement about the work of the Iranian Republic Guards Corps in their activities in Australia is we're going to have to up the level of security for government, for defence and many other institutions in the country, because the Guards Corps will be back. More broadly, I think in the world that I've described here, I see Australia under increasing pressure. I see the business community under increasing difficulty. I think this is a trend which is happening right now that's going to call on more requirements for security around many facilities, many properties. So I think the demand for the industry is there. But the level of risk and threat that the industry will have to deal with is growing also, and that may require some changes in terms of how the industry responds to it.
What does the changing world order mean in a practical sense for our national security, both at a government and corporate level?
Now, that's the second question from you. You're being very naughty. I really do hope someone else wants to ask a question here too. Well, we're moving into a period of pressure. I think, as I reflect on my comments to you, if you only take one sentence away, it's the sentence that said you have to contemplate how your business will function in a world where Australia is at war in the second half of the 2020s. Okay, that's worth just digesting a little bit. Australia at war in the second half of the 2020s. I don't think that's going to be a bullet that we can dodge, even though the government is minded to try that idea. And so that is going to have a profound impact on business. It's going to have a profound impact on your ability to recruit, because a lot of people will be going into the military, for example, in those contexts. So we're moving into a very different world now.
Yeah, just a question. What do you see as the knock-on effect to New Zealand with Australia being dragged into that conflict potentially? Do you see New Zealand following suit or being more of a backroom support of Australia?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, one thing that we have seen the New Zealand national government do, which our government in Australia has not done, is to announce a significant increase in defence spending. In New Zealand terms, it won't make 2% of gross domestic product, but it's a big lift from where New Zealand has been in past decades. So I think New Zealand sees itself as wanting to play an international role, and is often the case where Australia goes, New Zealand has to sort of contemplate its own position about where it goes to. I think intelligence cooperation will continue. I think the free movement of people between the two countries is always going to make for a requirement to think more closely about how we work in security terms. And then the final point I'd make is burden sharing between Australia and New Zealand about security in the Pacific. So as you know, we're both very heavily invested in relations with Pacific Island countries. New Zealand more so in some locations than Australia, particularly around Polynesian countries. And I think that's going to lead to a need for a stronger Australian and New Zealand presence in the Pacific Island region, in part to compete with a very evident Chinese interest in wanting to establish military bases in some countries. So I can see Australia and New Zealand getting closer, but also demanding more of each other in terms of what they do in defence and security.
Thank you for a very thoughtful presentation. In the early part of your presentation, you mentioned that the Ukrainian war should go on for quite a long time to come. Do you have a view as to what the eventual outcome will be? Will other European countries actively put boots on the ground and push Russia back?
Yeah, so would go on rather than should go on. I just can't see that Ukraine is not yet ready to give up the part of its country which has been occupied by Russia. And I think the Ukrainians have shown that they're more than willing to and more than capable of sustaining a high-level fight against Russia, and that's what they'll do. One of the interesting consequences of the arrival of Donald Trump is that he has been able to achieve what the last 3 or 4 American presidents have been unable to achieve. Bush, Clinton, Obama, Biden, they all wanted the Europeans to spend more on defence, but the Europeans never did it. Trump has forced them to come to the table. Trump and Russia have forced the Europeans to come to the table on that. So I think that for a lot of Europeans, they understand that the front line in the war with Russia begins in Ukraine, and they will continue to support Ukraine. Growing their defence industry as fast as they can, and that's one of the constraints, is that they're just not making ammunition and weapons fast enough to deal with the Ukrainian demand. So I would lay odds that the prospect of a peace settlement that's being considered right now is pretty remote in 2025. And that the Europeans, if not the Americans, will continue to back the Ukrainians for some time to come. The Russian strategy now is to try and wear the Ukrainian population down to a point that they're prepared to say, "Look, we've had enough. We want to go to the peace table." But I don't think that's actually anywhere near happening at this point. Okay, I think it might be time for coffee. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.